Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Julia and I will discuss a New York Times article about affirmative action for boys entitled, "There was definitely a thumb on the scale to get boys." Our question from a listener will also be with Julia. A Speakpipe question was sent in following up on the original conversation that Julia and I had, asking which colleges accept students who are standard strong. And for our interview, we'll resume part 2 of 3 with Rick Clark and Brennan Barnard, and they're answering the controversial questions in college admissions today. And finally, our college spotlight, it will be Lisa and Linda talking about Lisa's recent trip to the University of Dayton. We're coming to Ohio. Hey, Julia, how are you?
Hi, Mark. I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I know we're in the throes of heavy, intense admission stuff,
Yes,
but
it's October.
I like the energy, though. The energy of it excites me. I couldn't sustain this for 12 months, but there's something about the energy that just, to me, I don't know. Maybe I'm a junkie.
No, I think why would we be in this if we don't like a little adrenaline,
There
and
you
a little
go.
pressure cooker just for a couple months of the year?
Awesome. Well, I'm excited about our article we're going to talk about today, but before we do, we have an admissions tip, and I'm going to let Julia talk about the importance of the portal. What is the portal, how colleges use the portal, and what you as a student need to know about the portal?
Absolutely. This is actually super important. And every year for the last, how many years I've been in admissions, there's been some sort of catastrophe that involved a student not really investing in the importance of the portal. So nearly all colleges, after a student applies, and I know we've talked about this before, will then send the student an email to set up a portal. So this is sort of unfortunate because the Common App is lovely and that it's one landing page for all of your schools. But guess what? That goes away after you've submitted. So you'll get an individual portal for each school. It's really important to check your email because I know some of my students, when they get that email about their portal set up, it goes to spam or to trash. So if you don't get, some colleges are really quick. You might get a portal set up within minutes after submitting your app, and some it can take a couple days. But if it's gone more than maybe 3, I don't know how you feel, Mark, but maybe 3 days and you haven't gotten an email set up for your portal, you might want to call the college and double check. I probably have about...
Well, let me say something about this, Julia.
Yeah.
I had a student this week that freaked out because they submitted their Clemson app. And then they started hearing about the portal, what's this portal? And so I just went on and sent them the link directly from the Clemson website about how to set up their portal. So I don't know if it was a delay because this is all happening at like 11 at night. It's late. I'm a night person.
Of course.
So I don't know if it went to spam or I just sent it to them when they asked and they're freaking out. So a lot of schools do have it when you go log in. There's an opportunity to set it up if you don't get the link.
Yep.
Why don't you talk about some of the kinds of things that schools communicate, through the portal to students?
Yeah. So the 2 most important pieces, or maybe 3, is first, if you have missing items as part of your application, that is how colleges communicate with you about missing items. And in fact, a lot of colleges are not going to be kind and send you an email and say, hey, we noticed a teacher recommendation is missing, or hey, we don't have your transcript from your previous high school. That is on you most of the time to be checking that portal and see if things are missing. So it is really important to do that. But I would say also, sort of a la what Mark just said about checking websites, is some colleges, it's instantaneous that your portal reflects the materials that have been submitted and downloaded. Some colleges, I'll give a little shout out to UChicago, usually will say to students in their first communication after submission, like, it can take us about 2 weeks to process everything. So please do not flood us with calls the following business day being like, where's my teacher regs? Where's this? That doesn't really work for you because they might still be downloading it. So I do tell students that if an item is missing, like, wait a little while, but certainly if it's like within 7 days after submission and the college hasn't communicated that it might need up to 2 weeks or whatnot. MIT has also been in that position before too. So, good to check because the college does say it's on you to check your portal. And most of the time, what I have found with my students is not necessarily missing teacher recs or things like that, but the colleges all have different score reporting policies. And this is where I see most of my students get dinged, is that maybe they self-reported and wanted their scores considered, but the college does not allow for self-reporting. You have to have sent your scores. And oftentimes my students will miss that policy, and then they keep getting all of these portal sort of pings saying, we need your scores, but they assume, oh, I reported them, so I'm all set. I don't need to send them. And the next thing you know, they've missed the cutoff for reporting the scores through the testing agency, and they are bumped from maybe like early action or early decision to regular decision.
Yeah, there can be all kinds of things in the portal. I know last year Hamilton had what they called an optional question, and it was basically like a why Hamilton. So, exactly. It was a little sneaky because it's like get you to apply with real limited effort. And now that you're all in, you have like this thing that it's probably going to hurt you not to do it. It's an interest test.
Exactly.
Right. And so there can be that. And then all the stuff around orientation and just notification about like important things over the summer.
Right.
That you need to do, so just become familiar with it for your schools. I know it's a pain to have to manage so many, but it's better than missing important intel.
Yes. It's also where you'll get your financial aid package.
Yes, that's important.
And your admission decision. So you would want to be in the portal.
Yes. Yeah. So many. And that's actually been going on for a while. I remember back in 2006, Susan will remember this, a student named Naquan, New Jersey. And I remember, it was time for his admissions decision. And I was with him at the portal because it was that nervous moment when he logged in, and he got in, and guess where it was, Julia? Take one guess.
Oh, well, is it my
Vassar?
Favorite? Yay! That's what I was going to guess.
For those of you who don't know, Julia went to Vassar, so that's why I had to share that story. But I remember being with him as a counselor, and so portals have been around for a while because that was 2006.
Yeah.
But it feels like colleges are relying more on them now.
Yes. Very much so. Yes. I've also seen too increase in colleges offering for optional pieces to only be through the portal, whereas in years past, maybe you use Slide Room for a arts portfolio. That's still very popular, but there's lots of things that you might need to upload in the portal. The optional videos is usually you can't upload your video until you get your portal, and then you put it there. So there's actually lots of activity after you submit that occurs in the portal that really makes all the sense in the world to be really vigilant on those pieces.
I'm doing a complete audible here. I was about to go into admissions vernacular and I had something in mind, but I'm changing it. So Slide Room, that's a common term. People should know about Slide Room. Julia, tell our listeners what Slide Room is. And it's been around a long time and it's really popular, especially for, artistic majors, right? Talk about it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So Slide Room is a service that a lot of colleges, if they are willing to accept a arts portfolio, so that could be music, it could be visual arts, it could be creative writing sometimes, that allows the student to kind of showcase their work. And also it's sort of like a little gallery or portfolio itself where the student will submit work, but also submit write-ups as to what the pictures of the work might be. Also, sometimes some colleges with their arts portfolio asks for a teacher recommendation to accompany that works in that field. So if you're submitting some painting portfolio, then you would have a painting teacher comment. Slide Room, while it's one place or one vendor that all these colleges use, unfortunately, Slide Room is actually different for each college that uses it. So even if you complete one Slide Room, you have to complete the next Slide Room at the next school, things like that.
Has to be complicated,
yes,
of course.
It has to be. But at least you get used to the sort of format of it. And it's a good, and basically where colleges do allow for a submission of portfolio, that allows for them to send it right over to the right department. So that way potentially they can review it. So I know like at Haverford, you do not want me reviewing like your music prowess or your art prowess. So we would send that over. Yes. I might think it's great, but it's not. So we would send that over to the right departments. It's unfortunately not every college uses Slide Room, and it's also you do need to also be vigilant here. What are the policies for? Some colleges only allow for an arts portfolio if you're applying for a specific arts major. Some actually have earlier deadlines. I know like some of my students just submitted to Stanford early action for October 15th because you have to submit early for your portfolio. And then some colleges might offer for you to upload one, but they're not going to send it over to a department. So you do want to pay attention to the policies, and also where to upload your portfolio. So it might be Slide Room, might be the portal. I've even seen it in Common App itself where a student can say, yes, I'd like to submit a portfolio. And then you'll get the instructions as to how to submit that if it's not through Slide Room.
Our big number, it is 67. I'm drawing it right from the article we're going to transition to. 67% of incoming students at Tulane and 67% of second-year students at the University of Vermont are women. 2/3, 1/3. And that is a good segue for us to talk about the article which appeared in the New York Times, and several of you sent it into us.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
And the article is entitled, "There was definitely a thumb on the scale to get boys." Very enticing title there. And the subtitle is, "Declining male enrollment has led many colleges to adopt an unofficial policy, affirmative action for men." So this article appeared in the New York Times by Susan Dominus, and it was published on September 8, 2023, and then it was updated on September 26, 2023. So the article starts out talking about this survey that's done by this group called Marriage Pack, which is this matchmaking service. Many campuses use this popular service. And students are kind of, intrigued. It's supposed to be this detailed survey, and then it's supposed to let you know, who might be a good long-term partner for you. So when the results came in at Tulane, of which 900 women participated, they were surprised that they got an email that it was going to be a friend match instead of a love interest match. And it goes on to talk about these are the kind of creative things schools are doing right now in light of this gender skew that's happening on campuses. And so it goes on to say that this is not just at Tulane, but it's at so many schools. It talks about how really across the country now, we're right on the cusp of being 60-40, female, male. And it's worse at HBCUs, or, worse, or however you want to call it. The skew is worse. At HBCUs and community colleges, those numbers are even higher. And it talks about how the one place you don't see it is, I'll read this, colleges with powerhouse football terms or the word technology in their name, or elite schools for engineering like Carnegie Mellon. They tend to be closer to parity, or in some cases even have more men. But it's safe to say that a college graduate under 60 today is more likely to be female than male. And it talks about how this gender gap in education starts really early. Girls are already outperforming boys when it comes to reading and writing by the time they're in fourth grade. It's a very noticeable advantage. This is not a new thing. A lot's been written on it. Some people have had theories that girls like to please their teachers and boys don't care. They want to play soccer balls. And others have theories about it has to do with difference in brain development. But then there's been inconsistent scientific findings on that. Some people believe that most of the female teachers are, or most of the elementary teachers are female, and they don't know how to relate to boys. There's all kinds of theories out there as to why this gender gap starts at a young age. But it continues to excel and exacerbate even as you go further along into school. Girls get higher grades, even in STEM subjects. And by the time students graduate, when you look at students who are in the top 10 of the class across the country, 2/3 of them are women. Interesting, though, men have historically done better on the SAT, even that women get better grades, which kind of says something about the SAT. If it's supposed to be so predictive, why is it that, it's not lining up? Now, women recently inched past men on the ACT, and they have been closing the SAT gap as well. And so there's, there's a lot of consternation about this, a lot of talk. This has been going on for decades and decades, but it's exacerbated under the pandemic. And there's lots of theories as to why is this gap getting even larger. Some people believe that wages are higher for young people in the past, which creates an immediate opportunity compared to the cost of paying tuition. And we've talked about this before. You got the Amazons and the DoorDash paying $20+ an hour with benefits, and that may be more than your father made.
Right.
That can look really appealing. And also some of the higher paid jobs tend to be more male dominated jobs than female dominated jobs. The article talks about jobs like construction and technology, which tend to be male dominated, tend to pay more than jobs like elder care or cosmetology, which women tend to do more often. And then there's the conservative liberal gap that we have. Some people, the article talks about that. It talks about that conservatives have been increasingly devaluing higher ed, believing that, especially liberal arts schools, they think are pushing gender ideology, and those institutions they feel are threatening the traditional concepts of masculinity and therefore not appealing to men. The article talks about Richard Reeves, who's a scholar, and he's written about male drift at the Brookings Institution for years. And the rising rates of suicide amongst men and distressing signals that are happening in the culture. Men without college degrees tend to be underemployed and unemployed and less likely to marry. The article goes on to talk about how male enrollment plummeted after the pandemic, but female enrollment has been starting to bounce back slowly, but has not been bouncing back for men. So while this longstanding gender gap has been in place, it's been exacerbated by COVID-19, and it's really gotten, in some places, really extreme. The article talks about how this is not just of concern to men, but also to women, because women don't want to be at a school that's dominated by women unless they're choosing a women's college. And so it says, this has gotten too extreme at some schools, and students of all genders start to lose interest in attending. It talks about gender parity as something that is an institutional priority for most private colleges and universities. Quotes a well-known college counselor on that. And then here's a quote from the article that I thought was interesting. It says, some schools are trying to attract male applicants by improving their sports programs. Others are investing more heavily in buying boys' email address or giving incentives that they do not offer girls, such as free baseball caps or stickers for filling out information on their website. And then it says marketing materials are sometimes designed to speak specifically to young men. And then Julia quotes one of our favorite people in admissions, who you and I both interviewed on this podcast, Heath Einstein, the dean of admission at TCU, he recalls a pamphlet that was known internally as the brochure. Get it? The bro?
I love that.
The brochure. It featured shots of the football team and a rock climber, a male student shoving cake in his mouth. So it says, but the easiest way for many competitive schools to fix the gender ratio is in the selection process, at which point admission officers often informally privilege male applicants. It goes into the history of this. It's a really long article. In fact, if you're subscribed to the New York Times, you can listen to this as an audio as well. And the audio is 30 minutes. So it's like a little podcast just on this. But it's worth checking out. So it talks about how the number of women seeking higher degrees soared in the 60s and 70s. And as early as the early 80s, more women attending college than men already. And the trend continued so much so that schools started implementing formal admission policies in the late 90s to address it. One example it gives, and I didn't know this about University of Georgia. It's so interesting. I knew that there was this history where they had been sued over race and they backed off and got scared and they hadn't been practicing affirmative action, even that Georgia Tech did, and because it wasn't outlawed in the state. Mm-hmm. I knew all that, but I didn't know the history. So this is what it says. It's interesting. The University of Georgia, admission officers were automatically giving male candidates a 0.25 points in their rating system, which had a maximum of 8.15. In doing this, the school managed to maintain a ratio of 45 men to 55 women. That year, 3 white women filed suit against the University of Georgia System's Board of Regents, claiming that the school had discriminated against them on the basis of gender and race. The university was also giving non-white applicants an extra 0.50 points. The young women lawyers argued that the extra points for men violated the Equal Protection Clause under Title IX, which guarantees equal educational opportunities for men and women. The district court overseeing the case ruled the policies unlawful, and although the school appealed its race-based policy, it dropped its policy on gender. So that's some interesting history. So it goes on to talk about what very interesting. It's what it says about Title IX. So Title IX actually does not prohibit gender-based affirmative action. And I didn't know this either. In 1972, when the details for Title IX were under discussion, the presidents of some of the most elite colleges and universities persuaded legislators to exempt the admission policies from the law. So in 2021, a Duke Law Journal talked about how Katie Liu, who then was a law student, explained that they were worried that high numbers of women right away might render the school unrecognizable to the male alumni whose donations were so crucial. Such high female enrollment would even make fundraising harder, they argued. So I'm going to continue to summarize this, but I'm curious your thoughts on that. Well, let me just stop midstream. I'll finish that in a second. But does that feel like sort of male centricism? I mean, what are your thoughts on some of this stuff?
I'm thinking of my own personal values, but then also what I've seen happen in real life. Like,
sure.
So Vassar, I'm glad we talked about that earlier, it was a historically a women's college and went co-ed in 1969. And even when I was a student there, it was nearly 70% female, 30% male. And and Vassar, just like other women's colleges, does struggle with a robust endowment compared to its peer institutions, because of not having the economic mobility of women in this country. So while I would hate to sort of be as crass or explicit as like, this won't attract male money, I do think that that's an element at play, right? Yeah. About being able to build a robust endowment. And unfortunately, because of society, men are often the people who can donate, have the highest donation ability.
So someone understands why you don't like it. You sort of understand some of the legit realities. Otherwise, you're going to have a class that's skewed by gender to the extent that maybe men or women both may not like it. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah. Yeah, or more that I could, especially, you know, I'm looking at thinking of Haverford as well, which was all men till 1980, or even when I have my students get interviewed by an older alum where they're college co-ed now, but was previously all men, there is an element at play where donors are not as apt to give to the college unless they feel like it is in line with their fond memories, where they hope that the university goes. Not that it's explicitly anti-women or anything, but that I could absolutely see from like a marketing perspective, if that makes sense, that
No, I know what you're saying.
people with higher donation ability, you want to kind of cater to that if you want to stay afloat.
You know, this is getting off topic, but I was having a conversation 2 or 3 years ago along this topic as it relates to Pell Grant and First Gen. And it was somebody was talking to me about Williams College in particular. And they're like, you know, as these schools start getting up to 20-25% First Gen and Pell, their advancement offices must be freaking out, because those are not families that are coming with the ability to give the big donations.
Right.
So there's a balancing act in education, you know, between wanting all voices to be present, wanting education to be a pathway to social mobility, but then the reality of how dollars, like these things are really in tension with one another. So I'll keep reading. So the article goes on to quote several admission officers who were really transparent about the fact that, there was an extra thumb on the scale for men. There just was. Angel Perez, who ran Trinity's admission office, Trinity College in Hartford, until 2020, now head of NACAC. He's interviewed in the article. And he says it wasn't unusual for the initial selection rounds for there to skew to heavily favor women. And then this is a quote from him. There were some years when it was in the extremes. And as the director of the office, he says, and I'd say, we just can't do this. He says, I can't come up with a class of 20% men. That's just not good for the campus. At some point, he said, the team would have to go back and seek more men to balance out the class. And then there's a quote here from, I apologize if you're listening if I butcher your name, Saurav Guha, who was the assistant dean at Wesleyan from 2001 to 2004. And Saurav says, there was definitely a thumb on the scale to get boys. Quote, we were just a little more forgiving and lenient when there were boys than there were with girls. You'd be like, I'm kind of on the fence about this one, but we need boys. Jason England, a professor of English at Carnegie Mellon who worked in admissions at Wesleyan from 04 to 06, said the process sometimes pained him, especially when he saw an outstanding young woman from a disadvantaged background losing out to a young man who came from privilege. That sounds like something you would think and say, Julia.
Maybe that was nicer than I would say it.
That's true. The understanding is that if we're going to have close to a 50-50 split, we need to admit men, and women are going to suffer, he says at that time. So for the sake of a well-rounded student body, Wesleyan's leadership still believes in making choices that yield an even ratio, which sometimes means passing over an exceptionally qualified girl in favor of a boy whose application is not quite as strong. You had people who were really superb, but they were all shortstops, and you wouldn't take them, or violin players, said Michael Roth, Wesleyan's president, because you need other people in the orchestra. It's the old football orchestra argument that we often use. You know, it goes on to talk about the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights had an investigation in 2011 looking at 19 colleges and universities in the Mid-Atlantic and their gender differentiation, discrimination, use what you want. But the inquiry was dropped in 2011 on the grounds that the statistics the panel received were not sufficient for accurate analysis. Even now, the Supreme Court has struck down race-based affirmative action. Colleges are very likely not panicking about their efforts to maintain some control over their gender ratio. The Supreme Court gives parties more leeway to discriminate on the basis of gender than it does on the basis of race. Nonetheless, Einstein says he has heard representatives of the most elite institutions discuss the possibility of stripping information about gender from the versions of their applications that admissions officers read. Admission officers could not help discerning the sex of the applicant in most instances, but that small formal change in policy might still give litigants seeking ideal testing a ground to target other schools. They're doing everything in their power, Einstein said, not to be at the epicenter of a lawsuit. So I could go on and on, Julia, but I want to get into talking with you. I'll just make one more point. It does say that football, while seen as a panacea, it actually isn't. The research shows that as the health risks of football grow, there's 73 schools actually added football over the decade or so, some even adding a roster of 100 players. But that also changes the culture. And for that reason, some schools are now turning to sports such as men's rugby and men's volleyball that don't have the high costs associated with having to spend millions and millions on football coaches, stadiums, and large rosters. So where do you want to go with this? I'd love to know your thoughts.
Sure. I definitely see this all the time, especially as someone who went to a small liberal arts school and worked at a small liberal arts school. I would actually say that was probably the biggest thing we would think about is the gender balance, because it was true that women were far more represented. When I was at Vassar, the most common tour guide question I would get as a young person was usually from a dad who had a daughter in the process and was curious about her dating prospects, to which we had a stock answer, which is, you're not here to get your MRS degree, right? So it's like, it's out there. We had a stock answer for it. I definitely.
But you're bringing up an important point. You're bringing up that parents and students are female students are concerned that the ratio doesn't get out of kilter too much.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's fair. And if you think about, and I do think actually people do see beyond the dating prospects. I do think people see the merits of, just like with racial diversity and economic diversity, the merits of learning from people who are different than you. And the article makes the point too that this is likely the real world that you work with. You might be in a space that has a lot more gender parity than your college. But I definitely see this on the other side as a counselor very much play out, right? Where I've had conversations where I'm like, well, you are a boy, and that is, that can be helpful even in the most of selective pools, especially me being based in the Northeast. We have a lot of students interested in sort of the small liberal arts in the Maine, New York, Massachusetts area. And it's so selective. And sometimes I'll actually have students come in and say like, well, I'm a boy, so that should help me. Right. Like, no, it is not that much of a bump as you think it is, but it is a consideration. And the article makes this point too. I definitely see it play out, especially in recruitment, at Division III programs, 100%, where, for lacrosse, for sports that maybe are bigger draws for the college at Division III level, my students who are recruited there, who are identify as male, have a far different academic profile than my girls who are recruited as athletes there, even for like big sports like a soccer or field hockey. So that also just goes to show the emphasis we place on male sports versus women's sports as well. But I do see this play out in every sort of area as a counselor.
Yeah, I would say every year when I look back at all the decisions that occur for the students that I work with, there's always a few that surprise you both ways, right, Julia? We talk about this, right? There's a few that, wow, that student, I did not think they were going to get those options, or wow, I really kind of surprised that school passed on that kid. Like we get, we don't get a ton of them, but we get them every year. Most of the time when I have, maybe even all the time, honestly, I don't want to say all, is such a strong word, but no, I can think of one exception, but 98% of the time, if I'm surprised that somebody got in, it's usually the boy. It's usually the boy that it is. It's like, wow, that would not have happened for a young lady. And this can be discouraging if you're listening to this and you have girls and you don't know this. Lisa has really had some great conversations with me about this topic. Like, We already deal with the gender pay equity.
Right.
When we get out in the workforce, we deal with the glass ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
And now, like, to know that boys get a thumb on the scale in the admission process, there's something that just doesn't land well with me about that. Even if even if I understand the reasons mentally, there's something emotionally about that that just doesn't feel right. Mm-hmm. And I totally get that. That's a very natural, instinctive emotion. But we just want people to know about it, to not be naive, because it really can have ramifications for your college list building if you're building your list on your own. Mm-hmm. And it also can have ramifications for your own expectations when decisions start coming in. Like if I have one student and let's say they still want to apply to that school, but one person in their mind sees it as like, this is a stretch school, but I'm going to apply to it anyway. And the other student thinks it's a likely. Mm-hmm. Big difference in typically how they react if both of them don't get in.
Right.
You know, the one that doesn't get in that thought it was a stretch school, they're like, well, I kind of knew I was taking a shot. But the one that's not, they're like, I didn't get in. You know, they're freaking out. So I think it can have ramifications for you putting your list together, and it certainly can have ramifications for the expectations that you have. And I don't find the average person that I work with is that knowledgeable about this. Some are not knowledgeable at all. Mm-hmm. Some of them, I literally had a conversation yesterday. Now it was in the context of telling somebody we're about to record this. And I just sort of thought that somebody I'm working with, I just kind of thought they knew this. And they're like, really? That goes on? You know? And so a lot of people are not aware of it. It is definitely more pronounced at certain schools.
Yes.
Like when you look at Vassar is historically a women's college. So where's all the alumni going to come from? All the lineage, it's all going to be, you know? So yeah, you're going to see it more there. You're going to see it more at small liberal arts schools that don't have football and that don't have engineering and techs, you know, those, the real tech oriented majors that do tend to appeal to male men. You know, like I said, community college HBCUs, you're going to see it there. You know, you tend not to see it. In fact, you tend to see the opposite at the Institute of Technologies.
Yes.
A lot of them are like 70-30 in the other direction.
Right.
You know, I do think that it's primarily not motivated by discrimination because you look at those tech institutes, I see them trying to do the same thing as well to try to get more women. Now, some of that stuff in the article, that felt like it was pushing it, the way the powerful schools were working the refs when it come to Title IX and making sure, like, it feels like some of that felt very old boyish to me. But you know, to be forearmed is to be forearmed is to be oh, I always mess these things up. What's the saying, Julia?
Forewarned?
Forewarned is to be forearmed. There you go. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. So knowledge is power, and hopefully you guys just having this knowledge here will allow you to apply it in your everyday to your college search. Not trying to dump a bucket of cold water on your zeal over here, but also don't want people to be naive. Right.
I was a women's studies major. This is near and dear to my heart.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Hey, Julia, should I let our listeners know about the little mishap I had in the planning?
Up to you. I mean, it only benefits everyone else, basically.
Okay, that means yes. So, you know, Julia and I, we're here to answer a question from a listener that is kind of a part 2 question to one that we answered before we thought was a great question. And so before we get started, you know, I'm going over the admissions tip and admissions vernacular, big number. And then I say, snap, we're not doing it in the news. We don't have to do any of that. Let's save it for later. But then we got to talking about one, and we're going to do a bonus one. We're going to at least do the tip. And I don't know if it'd be fair to say this is controversial or not. I don't know. What do you think, Julia? Like, we talked about it before we did it.
Yeah. I mean, I have a little hesitancy, so I guess that suggests some controversy.
Yeah, so I'm probably a little more comfortable than this with Julia. I think Julia's maybe comfortable if it's asked the right way. Would that be fair?
Mm-hmm.
You know? So what I am encouraging students to do, and in the right setting, could be you've been at a fair, there's nobody really in line, you've had a kind of a good conversation for a while, you sort of feel like you're building a little bit of rapport. And the question is this, if you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to know how you guys rate an applicant. Like what's like I know some schools have rubrics, like different categories where they assign scores. And I'd love to know sort of how your school, what your categories are for rating an applicant. And I like the question for two reasons. One, if the person shares the information, you can get some very valuable information from the rep about the school. And if this sounds really theoretical, we'll sort of give a couple examples. So I'll share a couple of them with you. One is Emory, and Emory's rubric is 4 things on a 1 through 5 rating scale. So you get a rating on the curriculum, 1 through 5. By the way, in their system, high is good. Okay, you get a rating on your extracurriculars, you get a rating on your recommendations, and then you get an IC or an intellectual curiosity rating. So I like people to know that because it's immediately signaling to you what are sort of the things they value the most. And my view is that a lot of people won't mind sharing it if it's asked respectfully. Mm-hmm. And even if they're a little more guarded, I mean, I experienced this on the podcast, Julia. Sometimes I can ask very bold questions to interviewees and they're really transparent, and some are much more guarded with me. But my view is that if they're a little more guarded, if you ask it respectfully, and I think a good way to ask it respectfully is to couch it with saying something like, if you don't mind sharing, I'd love to know. People will be impressed that you asked that question. I mean, people remember people who ask very good questions. Mm-hmm. I think people really underestimate how much you can stand out, in an information session, in a school visit, at a fair with really good questions. So what are your thoughts? Because, that's one thing I love about having 7 co-hosts is you guys get different perspectives. Tell me what you think, Julia. Like, do you feel like I'm a little uncomfortable with this, or what are your thoughts? Because I'm comfortable with this.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. What my hesitancy was when you first said it, Mark, is I'm trying to think not all of my 17-year-olds would ask that in the way I would hope they would. Sure. But the intent is great. And indeed, I remember one year we had our recent interviewee Lee Coffin came and did a kickoff program for our students. And he was talking about how exactly that, how, for example, kindness and compassion was a metric of which they were particularly looking for. So students would get evaluated on that. So I do think it's really helpful, especially if, and this might segue as well into our listener question, but also that understanding why a school of equal sort of selectivity or 2 schools of equal selectivity might make different decisions on a student, right? Is that there might be in those metrics some institutional priorities, maybe intellectual curiosity isn't enough, but the ability to also think flexibly. Can you revise your opinions? Are you open to the opinions of others? So you do get some flavor of that normally. So I do think it's a great question to ask. And then you might really get a sense of also how the college reads students, and that where you might want to think about how you show up in the application.
Well, one of the reasons why I'm comfortable with this is I've just heard a lot of admission officers share it just on their own, just voluntarily at presentations. And you're completely right. It is an insight into what they value. So, University of Pennsylvania uses a 3-tiered system for eval, and one of their 3 is the term impacting my space, which is, did you leave a big mark in a positive way? And so I think, one of the things Rod Skinner said when I had him on the podcast, there's a name that you're familiar with, Julia.
Yeah.
Her old boss who hired her originally. So, one of the listeners sent in a question that I had listeners send in questions, and then I read them to him. That's before our Speakpipe days. And one of the questions that somebody sent in was, how can you know a school's institutional priorities?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that Rod said is sometimes you can't know.
Right.
Right. And, but this is an insight into their institutional priorities.
Yep.
Like it really is. Like if you're going to make it a core eval in your rating rubric system, you're elevating that above other things.
Right.
You know, you really are. One thing that I've noticed, by the way, without going off on this too much, a lot of the most selective schools, intellectual curiosity is a big one for them.
Sure. Absolutely. Yep.
You know, I just had a thought when I did this 10-hour counselor in a box thing called Game Changer I worked on from 2012 to 2014. And before I went live with it, I had an admission officer from Haverford, your old school there, Julia, like evaluate the whole thing and say, look at this. I'd like to know if you think I missed anything. And I had this whole thing on 95 tips. And then the one thing that the rep said was, I just don't think you emphasized how important intellectual curiosity is enough in the evaluation.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a common one.
Yes.
But you'll see other systems. And anyway, I don't like the whole thing about that. You know me, I'm a chatterbox. I'm dangerous. And together we're both dangerous.
Yes, no, it's true. But it's good to know, like Michigan, when I talk with them, I often hear the word leadership. So that makes me think they must be, looking at that. Where at Haverford, we didn't have a metric of leadership. It wasn't as much as most students did have something like that. We were looking at impact in a more like informal way, whereas maybe a college is like, I'm looking for how many things you're ahead of or how many things you organize, stuff like that. So I think it's a great question to ask, just as long as you sound like you're asking in the right way.
Yeah, actually, we should have you elaborate on that, Julia. So what would be the wrong way to ask it? And what your concern is that your concern in talking to before the meeting was not the question. It's that if it comes out the wrong way, it won't land well. So talk about the wrong way.
Sure. I'm also mindful of the fact that my students in particular are coming from a place of privilege, right? We have my school has direct access to your rep at the most selective of colleges. And so sometimes in the exuberance or stress of the situation, a student might ask a question that sort of, it sounds as if they are trying to, find a secret formula, which we all know doesn't exist, or it sounds like they're just worried about how they show up to the college and not maybe about the better parts of the process where you're sharing your parts about yourself, or you're looking for a good fit, not looking for a name that fits. So I would say basically, what I would worry about is one of my students or a student would be like, tell me how you evaluate applications. Like, what's the scale? What matters most? Like, what do you see for students who are admitted? What kind of scores do they have, and what sort of metrics do they have? Right. So
now you brought up a really good point that I wasn't thinking of. So I was just thinking of sort of delivering it sort of more from an entitled standpoint. Like, I think you have to ask in a way where you respect the fact that somebody might consider that proprietary.
Right.
And so I think you have to ask it that way, even that I find that most people don't if it's asked right, but somebody might. But you also brought another point up, which is, admission officers really like to use their encounters with students as an opportunity to get to know the student and for the student to get to know the school.
Right.
And if it comes off more like I'm trying to find out the secret sauce, how to get in.
Exactly.
That doesn't make a best impression, right?
No.
If it's more like I'm just trying to understand what you value,
right? Because
I'm curious about your school. That's very different than give me the angle, because whatever you tell me, that's what I'm going to contort myself into being. Exactly. So that I get like that. Yeah. And you're talking about that angle. Like it could come off with, tell me who I need to make myself look like to get into your school.
Exactly.
That's what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yes. Cause I find that sometimes, like in the Dartmouth example I just gave, the next thing I know is that year that we had more people applying ED to Dartmouth and writing essays about kindness. this, right? And I'm like, okay, in some sense you got the point, but also it's not about angling it. So yes, you're completely right, Mark. That's more just as long as and I think not being selfish or myopic here, but asking generally, how do you review applicants and not about yourself? And coming from a place of curiosity and openness should be fine.
Yeah. Well, I don't mind us going off on a tangent like this sometimes, Julia, because when I listen to the feedback that we get from whether it's emails or conversations I have with listeners, these are the kinds of things that make people listen to our podcast. So I know we took a little 10, 11-minute diversion from our Speakpipe question, but hopefully people found it valuable. All right. Well, the next voice you're going to hear is from a listener who we thought asked a super provocative question. So,
hi, I listened to today's podcast about who gets into the most selective colleges and was left wondering, which schools want, quote, standard strong kids? I understand from the last 2 Monday episodes that it's not schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Stanford. But what about the other Ivies? Ivy Plus schools? The next tier or 2 down? At some point, I've got to believe that there are top colleges that like and really want these kids who aren't prodigies, but who are amazing, highly accomplished students. So, in your opinion, which schools should these standard strong kids be looking at? Thank you so much in advance. I look forward to the podcasts every week and have recommended them to so many parents. You really are doing a huge public good. Thanks again.
Julia, we talked in our pre-meeting about sort of going back before we get into this and revisiting a little bit of our past discussion. I'd love to share with you something I've thought about since that last conversation, and then share anything you want to share about what I'm going to say, and then we'll transition into this very important question. So just as a recap for those who didn't hear it, Julia and I attempted to take on the question, what is the difference between two students and they both have really strong metrics? And by metrics, that's just my way of talking about the data side or the quantitative side of the application. So I'm talking about things like number of APs or HL, IB courses, AP scores, IB scores, curriculum, and of course, grades, GPA. And even, grade trends, I even put that in there. So just like the number side of things. And so someone's got like incredible numbers. And at the most selective schools, that's usually going to be north of 1550 on an SAT 35-36. So that would be the SAT. And then it's going to be mostly 5s with maybe some 4s sprinkled in on APs. And then, for IBs, it's going to be 7s and 6s, mostly in higher level, maybe occasional 5 on the numbers side. So you've got someone that's got all of that with really high grades, let's say a really high, whether a school ranks or not. This is someone that's really up there in a public school, top 1, 2, 3% of their class, and in a really selective independent school, top 10% of their class. Let's say you're talking about someone with that kind of profile. And we had said that there's a kid there that doesn't do well in the highly selective, the most selectives. We're talking the most selective. I sometimes call them the 1%ers. And there's a person that does. And we focused a lot on hooks, institutional priorities, and the extent to which somebody made an impact, a significant impact. And we talked about people that also were just standouts intellectually, like the student that the teacher would say, like, one of the best I've ever taught, that kind of thing. But there's one other thing I didn't say, and I thought about it afterwards. So I'm happy to get a do-over to share it. I've been thinking a lot, and this is just me looking over the years at who are the kids that get in. And I'll tell you something else I've noticed. When I see a kid who has a unique idea that somehow involves like improving society or making a difference, and it feels very genuine, like this is coming from a deep place from them, not their parents or some consultant. Nowadays there's so much talk about getting your passion project in the 7th and 8th grade, and I'm not talking about that. You have this idea, it's got some creativity to it, and it can improve society. And then if that person, especially if they can maybe mobilize some others to get on board toward that idea, those are also people I see do really, really well. And I'm going to give an example. This is scary to do because it's this year. But I'm working with this student, and he's super into AI comp sci, but he's really gotten passionate about the fact that a lot of AI facial recognition is set up to adversely judge dark-skinned people like South Asians, Black people. And he's done like copious research on this stuff. And it's totally self-driven. And of course, you know, this kid also has the other stuff. Like he's got all the metrics. You know, he's got all that stuff, the APs, the test scores, the blah, he's got all that. That's the kind of kid that I see people getting excited about. What are your thoughts on that? That's something that we never talked about before.
Yes, I agree. And I sort of struggle. You articulated that a lot better than I do. And I often have trouble sort of, and this is sort of why we talked about intellectual curiosity a little while ago, is that sometimes, and it's not necessarily the student's fault, like you go to a decently resourced school, so you've got all the metrics, you've got all those, you know, grades and whatnot, but maybe because of the style of your education or your resources, you've not yet had an opportunity or been encouraged to kind of think about things like this. And so sometimes where I do see the difference is I've got some really smart kids who are really good at pluggers, right? Like they do really hard work. They're very diligent. They're curious, but I see that would be a different outcome for them than my student who has thought really critically and flexibly about something that is a much more outward, that it has a global impact, or it really does sort of think about how do we make a positive impact on society. I do see that. I also see, though, among my students, because they have had those resources, it's kind of natural to them. They've been in a sort of DEIJ related curriculum since they entered my school. So in some sense, I even see
Julia, not everybody might know what DEIJ is. So go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So sort of my students are lucky enough, like their U.S. history course is taught through the lens of marginalized communities and not necessarily the history I got when I was in high school in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I do see some difference there. It's more the authenticity piece within that sort of passion or care or concern, just like you said, Mark, that sort of will usually maybe change the outcome in a different way for an equally strong student.
I mean, that is so true, because so many times people will meet with me and they'll want to start, well, okay, what's the passion project? Got to have a passion project. And I tend not to reinforce that, because it feels like it's coming from the parents, the one who's asking it, first of all. And I'm like, it has to be inside the kid.
Right.
You know, so, but the thing that, and I don't feel we've talked about this enough on the podcast. What is the psychology or the makeup of people that go into admissions? These are people who are not picking admissions because it's the highest paid job.
Right.
Not at all. In fact, they're actually working against their pocketbook. They're oftentimes very talented people that could make double or triple what they're making in admissions. So why are they going into admissions? Well, it's their love for kids, and sometimes their love for the institution, or a combination thereof. So they're service oriented, do-gooders, for lack of and that's maybe not the best word, but I know that can be interpreted different ways. But I'll say it this way: they're people that get excited about changing the world. And so when admission officers see someone that they feel is changing the world, I think that's one time when I see people get excited. And I don't think I articulated that well last time when we spoke. And I think a lot of times, I'll just say it this way, a lot of times it's easier to do that with something a little creative.
Sure.
It's just harder for something to pop if it's, oh yeah, heard that 10 times this week.
Right.
So, because I know it has that impact on me when I'm working with a student. Yeah. And they're like, that is the neatest, coolest thing that you care so deeply about. And I feel like I'm ready to run through a wall. But anyway, I just had to say that. So now let's turn our attention to the question. So what do you, I'm going to let you start out, Julia, with your thoughts, and then I'll chime in with mine.
So I think it's a great question. And I would really love if my students would also think like this. Sometimes they think like, I've done all the work, I've got everything on paper. Why can I not have those, maybe top 20 or so schools that have less than a 3% admit rate or whatnot? And I want to be clear that a top college can mean a lot of really great schools. Selectivity does not denote the caliber of the school necessarily at all. So there are, to me, a lot of great schools, or maybe what we would call selective colleges or name cachet schools that are in the market for standard strong students. They're all in the market for standard strong students. I'm just going to, again, use Lee Coffin's terms, is that when you get into schools with less than a 10% admit rate, there's just not room to admit all standard strong students. So it's not that you're an inappropriate applicant. There's just not room. Where there is room is thinking about some schools that they maybe admit less than 25% of their students, but maybe it's between like a 25 and 40% admit rate, or even a 20% admit rate as well. The other, like sort of schools like University of Rochester or Wake Forest, there are very selective schools out there that do have a little more room for students that are really high achieving students. And there's less of this sort of, what's that one piece that has gotten me distinguishable from some of these other equally strong students. Also, honors programs at colleges. I often have my students look into that. So maybe you're not initially thrilled about attending a less selective school because, again, students, understandably so, feel like their worth is wrapped up in the selectivity rate of the school they get into and decide to go to. But a lot of my students have loved, even if it's just a mental health boost, getting into the honors program at maybe like something like a Bucknell or a Lehigh, or even like University of Pittsburgh or UMass, our honors college here. These are all very still selective cohorts of students where you get some nice perks as well, and it's sort of a nod to your what high achiever you are as well. And you might even get some monetary perks in there too. So I find that also puts some value on a student, how they feel about themselves if they do miss at the schools that have a less than a 5% admit rate in the regular round. But that's not to say that there aren't also places where standard strong would work in the less than 5% admit rate. Looking at ED rates at certain schools. Certainly, for example, Northeastern, Tulane, University of Chicago. These are all, again, Chicago won't give us their data, but these are all schools that are the same, in the same sort of band of selectivity as the Ivy Leagues, but you have a much better go in the ED round at those places. So it's not to say that just being standard strong means you're out of the game at these schools that admit less than 10%, but being really savvy about, is there something that I have unique to some of these schools that is maybe underrepresented, and or I need to think about very selective schools, but maybe aren't less than 10% admit rate, of which my high achievement and my metrics can go a little bit farther because there's just a lot more room at that place.
You said a lot of things that I was thinking. So, I just remembered, Joy and I, we don't listen together to the podcast that much because she's in Raleigh and I'm in Atlanta, but we were together for a few days and we were driving and when I was back at my mom's 85th, and we listened to this segment together. And so Joy made a quote. She said after she heard it, she said, "So basically what you're saying is you have to be perfect." And we don't want to give that impression. I think the thing that I think is so important that we can't emphasize enough, and that is, and you brought up one of the things, which is early decision, but the role that hooks play. in this process.
Mm-hmm.
And not all hooks are equal.
Right.
Right. So some hooks, I'll name 3 hooks that really count a lot. So someone who can build a big building, that's going to count a lot. Celebrity, that's a big one. And recruited athlete in a revenue sport. Now, why is it those are so important? Because you're bringing money into the institution.
Right.
You're bringing money into the institution. But there are lots of other hooks that aren't maybe those really big ones.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, people that get in these schools, they have something.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about our conversation that might have given people perhaps a wrong impression is we're approaching it almost as if you're unhooked, if you're completely unhooked.
Right.
Then the bar is just going to be so hard because you're up against institutional priorities.
Mm-hmm.
So let me speak maybe a little bit more tangibly, concretely. So let's say you don't have one of those big hooks. Let's say you're a boy from the Midwest and you're interested in studying German and you apply ED. That's a kid that can compete, like in the most selective pools, where if you took another kid with those same metrics, but they didn't have some of those institutional priorities, not the big ones on the part of the school,
right,
but maybe smaller ones, they would end up getting waitlisted or maybe denied. But a school wants to attract more boys from the Midwest, Midwest, undersubscribed major, the combination of all of those things. Susan likes to always say, nobody gets in willy-nilly. Like everyone's always admitted for a reason.
Right.
And normally, because there's so many kids that have high numbers, normally you're going to be having one of those things that the school wants more.
Right.
And maybe it's even, for certain schools, maybe it's full pay, And I really think one thing that you said is really a good gauge, Julia, which is admit rates. Like as much as we say that schools can alter, massage, and manipulate their admit rates, and we know that they can, for the most part, it's a pretty good gauge.
Yep.
For the most part, it's a pretty good gauge. Like if you're looking at schools in single digits, just really tough.
Yeah.
Really, really tough, because most people not only are going to be strong, but they're going to have hooks.
Right.
And, and sometimes some of them are powerful hooks. So to me, it's hard to get away from talking about hooks when you talk about this conversation because once again, boy from the Midwest applying ED, interested in German, that could be somebody that could get really, I'll share a story. I was talking with Bill Fitzsimmons, who, has been over Harvard's office for 50 years, about a student I was working with. And this was a student, Caucasian female from Alabama, who was really high-level physicist.
Mm.
She'd really done serious, research. And so I was just talking with him about how would somebody like that land in your applicant pool? He said, I'm very interested, Mark. I'm interested. Female physicist, Alabama. So that's as a competitive pool as you'll get. But this is still somebody who's coming with some things, may not be, mom or dad can't build a big building, not a star basketball player or whatever. But I normally find it's the combination of you having something that the school wants, because these schools have so many people interested in them that it usually boils down to what are our needs.
Right.
And so I think when Julie and I were talking, if we gave the impression like it sounds impossible to get in, we were sort of comparing, at least I know I'll speak for myself, looking at the unhooked applicant.
Right.
The unhooked applicant trying to go up against hooked applicants, it's really an unfair advantage. And that's not to say that nobody ever gets in who's unhooked.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly happens. But normally there's little baby hooks in there. And so I think that plays a role. But I agree with you. Once you start looking at admit rates, and also you do need to look at the ED admit rate if you're applying ED.
Yep.
ED is a major, major factor. I mean, it's just these private schools, and I think even more and more and more, Julie, they're just taking more of their kids' ED. And I was listening to NYU. I mean, they made it so clear. It's ED1. I'm not talking ED2,
Yes.
ED1.
Yes. Yes. Just had this conversation with a family.
And so I mean, I'm hoping that I'm encouraging you because one, some of it is look at yourself and see where you may have some appeal to an institution that also
Right.
meets your needs.
Mm-hmm.
And then also know that you do have a few tools in your bag to make a super selective school not quite as selective, but certainly ED is not for everybody. We're not trying to, I feel bad. Part of me feels bad because, look, there's a person that says, I'm not applying ED. It's going to be $400,000 for me. I don't have that kind of money.
Right.
I'm
Exactly.
not trying to imply you should apply ED. I'm just trying to say, like, there is a path. I mean, there are people at some of the most selective schools in this country that have multiple Bs, not one B, two Bs, three Bs, even more Bs than that in their transcript.
Yep.
But they're getting taken over a straight A kid because, here's another hook that's not necessarily really powerful, but it's not ignored. And in some schools more than others, legacy.
Right.
So you throw in legacy with maybe an undersubscribed major, maybe a gender need or a location or some compositional diversity need, whatever it is. Maybe we're trying to get more first gen, more Pell, more full pay. Now you start to look like, okay, you are meeting the needs of the institution. And so I guess that's the bottom line that I want to convey is, are you someone who is meeting the needs of the institution? And if you are, then on paper, you may not have to be as strong as somebody else, just on paper, because you're meeting the needs of the institution. And I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my main thing I wanted to say. It's just, it gets difficult to throw out schools. I'm glad you did, because you sort of helped people think of sort of maybe a level that they may, like I think Rochester is definitely a great example of a school, and others as well. But it all still boils down to, what are their needs and what are you bringing to the table?
Right.
Let's take Rochester. Do you know how many high flyers they get in math and science, for engineering and some of their medical programs, computer science from certain international countries? That pool's ridiculously strong, and the numbers alone are not going to cut it. So I would love to list a lot of colleges' names here that would be schools for the standard strong student. I just can't, because it all comes down to the needs of the institution, and virtually every selective school has overrepresented applicants and underrepresented applicants. And I'm not referring to race, class, and gender, although that could be part of what makes somebody underrepresented. I'm talking about holistically, about what are the needs of the institution, what are underrepresented in their pool. For Rochester, identifying students that have a decent probability of coming is a huge institutional priority for them. Same for Case Western Reserve and so many others. So as much as I want to come on here and list a bunch of colleges, I found I just couldn't, because institutional needs drive everything. The best I can say is that if somebody is full pay and they're applying ED1 at a school with over a 40% admit rate, that is often an attractive applicant. But you still have to be competitive in the pool that you're in. For schools that look at major, one student could be very competitive, and another student with a similar GPA and test score profile and AP tests and rigor could be not competitive at the school that they're applying for. Because, I mean, if a school is like significantly need aware, and you are going to have a really, really, really large financial need,
Right.
like that school might be incredibly hard for you to get into. So any other thoughts, Julia?
No, I just want to make sure that I agree with you about us leaving the right impression, and also just being really clear that I think sometimes when we have these conversations, at least at my school, it sets up some sort of ill sentiment to students who might have a hook. And I would say that some of them are absolutely unfair. And some are to right the wrongs of society, and there's no advantage necessarily someone's getting. It's just if you've got two equal applicants, and one had far more obstacles in their way to have the same sort of academic achievement as the other standard strong student, then that needs to be something that's taken into account, just like the physicist from Alabama, right? So I just like to be clear about that, because usually around March, I get a bunch of emails, mostly from parents, about some other student took my kid's spot, because as if it works like that there's one spot for everybody, and then somebody with a hook elbows the other out of the way. It doesn't work as simple as that.
Actually, I'm so glad you brought that up, because we all hear that in the counseling room.
Yes.
We hear it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
People say it. I mean, I had somebody say to me the other day, like last Saturday, somebody from some great privilege, and she's like, no shot for my kid. My kid should have been black. Like that's one place that you hear it. You hear it toward race. You hear it toward athletics. You're starting to hear it more. People feel like, I wasn't homeless. I didn't sleep in a car or something like that. It can be hard to hear.
Yes.
Because people are in denial of all of their own privileges.
Yes.
That got them to be where they are.
Right.
They have so many advantages, namely educated parents.
Yes.
Who have set the table for them from birth.
Mm-hmm.
That's a massive advantage.
Right.
In some cases, in going to an incredible high school,
mm-hmm.
Is an advantage. And then there's all the, we haven't talked about this, but we have in the past, schools intentionally recruit from those schools because they know they're full of, so you're getting access to people, kind of like you and I were talking before when we were talking about that question. Mm-hmm. You live in a world where your kids are seen and rubbing elbows with these admission officers. Those are opportunities.
Right.
To make impressions. And there's and then the ability even to apply ED.
Right. Right.
You have such a massive advantage if you can apply ED as a full pay family.
Right.
And your family doesn't have to worry about, you just took your odds at any school and almost tripled them.
Exactly.
So, it's a little hard to stomach when people, it's a little, going back to the Texas race when Ann Richards said to George Bush, you're born on third base and thought you hit a triple.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. Some people born a foot away from home plate.
Yep.
And they think they hit a grand slam.
Right.
And I really encourage parents to try to teach your kids the privileges they have.
Yes.
It's very impressive. I might have shared this on the podcast before, but maybe I didn't. But I was having lunch actually on my trip to Colorado this summer with a podcast listener in Chicago, and she's also a teacher, but she was telling me how, Chicago, they have all the specialized schools,
mm-hmm.
and they, were consciously making decisions to make sure that socioeconomically different groups were represented.
Right.
And so there was a big announcement that happened when her daughter was in 4th grade, and all the kids were going ballistic about it because they were hearing from their parents, this is so unfair. And she said, I sat my daughter down and I told them why it is completely fair, mm-hmm. all the privileges that we have that other kids don't have. And her kid bought into that. And so I think there's a responsibility parents have, because entitlement isn't a good look.
No.
Colleges don't like it. Employers don't like it. And it's also a little bit insulting. The extent to which schools are looking for some of these underrepresented categories, it's because they're underrepresented. Right. So if you think about it, it's sort of like saying, I gave you a head start in a race, but yet I still passed you because your group's still overrepresented.
Still overrepresented. You're still benefiting more than, underrepresented groups. Overrepresented continue to benefit more than underrepresented.
Right, but you'll so oftentimes hear that it's so much harder for me.
Right.
As if you just were born with your 1570 and your
Yes,
4.3 at that really good school, as if that had nothing to do with all the people that have been propelling you up for 18 years.
exactly.
But you're right. So many times this conversation about hooks leads in the direction of it's so unfair for me.
Right.
Now, I've also come to realize that sometimes this is a way that people it's easier mentally for them to process bad news.
Right.
This is a psychological strategy of feeling good about yourself, is to say somebody else had an advantage I didn't, and that's why they got the carrot and I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know how I feel about that, I guess, but I just would say try to push back against that from your kid.
Mm-hmm.
Julie and I hear this all the time. We hear all the time people say to us, this unqualified kid got in.
Right.
All the time, right? I can't believe the school took this kid, like this kid was blah, blah, blah. And the implication was my kid was better than that.
Right.
And you're not teaching your kid a lesson that's attractive.
No,
So,
no.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to be preachy, but
No,
Julie and
I
I
think
see
it's
this all the
important.
time in the counseling room.
Yes. And I do, I don't know about you, Mark, but for the families that have sort of had these conversations and really reconciled with their privilege, if they do get bad news, I find that they handle it really well because it comes from a place that they understand that they will be good in life. They will be fine because they do have a lot of privileges, and that can be expressed at other schools as well. So I also find that those students actually do fare better in the process because they are able to see sort of the advantages they've had, and they've worked to either pay it back or make it more equitable, or just the simple acknowledgement of what they have can go a long way.
I've had quite a few good conversations in the last year with people who were interested in their kid going to the school at which they had legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And they were concerned that legacy doesn't seem like it's carrying as much weight as it used to. And the conversations have been encouraging to me because what they've said is, I cannot justify legacy. I can't justify it, but it just feels bad still. Like, you know what I mean? Like when it hits you and your kid, you can't help but be biased about your own kid. And I at least respect that.
Yes,
Because,
totally.
it's a human emotion to just really want anything you can for your kid. And if it's an advantage, whatever it is, you want to get it and use it because it's your kid. But at least when someone says, I'm not saying it's fair, I cannot justify it, I at least think that person has gone through some process of coming to some grips with their own advantages, in the system. And it just makes for a more winsome quality trait. I don't know how we ended up there, Julia, starting out on standard strong, or starting out on asking people what their rubrics were. But hopefully this was helpful for our listeners. It was a really awesome question. And for that excellent question, you are going to get the book Thinking Critically in College, The Essential Handbook for Student Success by Dr. Lewis Newman, who, if you missed that interview that Lisa had, it was a fantastic one. So, yes, we're on to a brand new book giveaway. And please send in your address so we can get it out to you. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Mark.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 2 of 3, the interview, this is the meaty part where it really gets good. Brennan and Rick have a disagreement about early decision. Each one shares their reason for their view on early decision. Rick discusses the encroachment of the federal government in regulating admission practices. Rick talks about how the admissions funnel is being threatened by all of the challenges out there. Brennan and Rick discuss legacy admissions. Rick talks about race-based affirmative action. Brennan talks about how athletic recruiting is the big conversation we're not having. Rick talks about how he and Brennan do not always agree on athletic recruiting at college admissions. And Rick talks about how some people are naive about the business realities of college admissions. I love this segment. Listen and enjoy. I actually have a follow-up question for you guys on this. So, as you know, there's been a lot of talk about, Congress getting involved and making early decision illegal and unfair, unjust practice. And I'm sort of two minds on that. Like, it is an unjust, unfair practice, but I feel like it's so part and parcel of what colleges do to predict yield and to not over enroll and to please their stakeholders, that I feel it would just fuel an underground secret ED system that would happen anyway. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Anything you want to share? Like, would you be an advocate of making early decision illegal or not?
I would. I say we get rid of it. I mean, the one thing, like Wake Forest has done something really interesting this year, and we're going to be interviewing Eric McGuire for our podcast, who's the VP there. They have early decision and early decision 2, but they've added early action just for first generation college students, and so it's non-binding. And so they still have the opportunity to apply early, but they don't have the financial pressures that early decision and a binding decision has. I think early decision just, again, developmentally, I think in terms of equity is just not a healthy thing in our ecosystem.
And I guess I would come from a bit of a different perspective on that. I mean, I would not be in favor of regulating or sort of a heavy hand on this. And really, it just goes back to, the fact that it is an ecosystem, that higher education is diverse and higher education is really broad. And just because of the way it operates, there's a necessity in students having information at a certain point that allows both them to make other decisions later, maybe on where they apply, where they choose to go, but then other schools to come in and make their class and become part of the conversation as well. I'm not saying that, again, by no means am I saying that early decision is the best solution, but I'm not in favor of it being legislated or stricken down in some way.
And Rick, how much concern do you hear out there about the autonomy being taken away for the individual schools by a heavy-handed government? And we've seen a number of actions now, right? Affirmative action is obviously a really, really big one. Right. I mean, because you had all the experts that came forward and gave their testimony and it was approved. And then you have Supreme Court justices just come in. They're not experts in the field and they make a decision. We have the taxing of endowments. And then, you go back to changes in NACAC and what it can do and can't do. I mean, these are all, and antitrust stuff that's been gone. There's been a lot of big brother stuff going on with the government and higher ed. So is that also a concern amongst people that, like you, VP of enrollments, like this trend toward not trusting us as professionals who know our field and we're experts and let us do our thing?
100%. I mean, and really, all those words you just said are the exact words coming out of the mouths of my colleagues around the country. And, on some level, it could even be exacerbated if you're in the public sphere. And it might even be further exacerbated if you're in the Southern public sphere in terms of, what's been happening politically and the interventions that have been occurring and some of the dictating that has also transpired. And, not to get too much into this, but that also, I mean, one of the things I look out at and am a bit concerned about is the next generation of people doing these jobs. And the more that we have regulations and the more that we have, again, that kind of heavy-handed interaction, I guess, the less I think people feel empowered and to be able to find their own path towards achieving some of their mission and some of their goals. And I can I can cite a number of different examples where that's true, both for as some of the macro ones you mentioned, and then even at the state level around the country and, the way that these systems are operating as well.
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, it inhibits innovation in a lot of ways. It inhibits the ability for colleges to work together in some of these antitrust lawsuits and to make the system better. And I think it also prevents colleges from, some of the ethical issues that have come out since the Department of Justice kind of attacked NACAC for the statement of good principles. some of the stuff that happens around early incentives and things like that, as colleges kind of fight over students, is just not healthy. It's not good for students. It's not good for the system. And so I totally agree.
And that is, unfortunately, I think, only going to proliferate because we're heading into what we've been looking out at now for 15 years, this whole birth dearth, Great Recession, sort of American decline in birth rates, lots of fragility in international markets as well. So the top of the funnel is heavily threatened. And so that's only going to bring about some of the type of strategies and actions that, Brennan was referring to.
Yeah, because people are in survival mode,
Yep.
And so,
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource for episode 373 is the Essential First Year College Dorm Checklist. You can find this at bigfuture.org, but we'll put a link in the spotlight. This checklist lists all the things you need for your first year of college. Just like when I pack and I go on a trip, I have a big checklist so I don't forget something. It's organized into categories. For example, it has the dorm room organization and storage checklist where it has about 15 things. College linens and laundry supplies, about a dozen things. Desk supplies, about a dozen things. Electronics and technology for your first year student, another 12. Shared with roommate items, it has a category where it's got about 6. Then toiletries, beauty, and hygiene. It's got about 20 in there. Clothing, about 20. Household and kitchen items, about 15. And miscellaneous, about 4. Great way for you to not forget something that you're going to need when you head off to college. Once again, it's our recommended resource for episode 373, and it's the Essential First Year College Dorm Checklist, and we'll put a link in the show notes. So let's just talk about some of the hot issues of the day. There's a lot going on in college admissions. There always is, but it seems like particularly now in 2023, there's a lot of things going on, and just want to get kind of your take on some of the hot issues. So one is legacy admission. Obviously a while ago you had schools like, MIT and Caltech and Pomona and Johns Hopkins get rid of it. Amherst a couple years ago. And then there's been this consistency in the 9 states that had outlawed affirmative action. Usually when affirmative action went down, legacy went with it. And so now there's a lot of look at legacy. And we've seen several schools recently, public and private, from the Virginia Techs to the Wesleyans and others. Do you see this being a steady trickle, or do you think it's going to go like certain things? Like, remember when test optional came and bang, it was here, like self-reporting test scores. When that got on, there was like a wave. Where do you see legacy admissions going in the next 3 to 5 years? Not going to hold you to it.
Yeah.
Just your sense of where you think it's going.
I think it's going to be a slow trickle. And I mean, again, I think we need to level set here that we're talking about the most selective schools in the country, right? Like at a lot of schools, this legacy issue just really isn't an issue, right? And even at some of the most selective schools, it's just a distraction. The legacy piece is a distraction from kind of the larger issues around how they welcome in a diverse class and, Pell eligible students and a bunch of other issues. It's become this kind of focal point that really doesn't have a huge impact when you look at it. You're talking like a couple applicants.
I was going the same place with that. Like, if you look at the 100 schools in the country that have a sub 25% admit rate, I mean, those are the outposts in higher education, not the signposts for higher education. And yet we treat them as if they are somehow representative of and the trend of the way college is going. It's just patently false. And the truth is, too, I mean, I think about our own process here at Georgia Tech, like legacy is not a factor that we're considering. Many of the students who are admitted they're being admitted on their own merits. It really doesn't matter. That's not part of the conversation. And yet, of course, that's going to be something that people will hold up as such. even if you think about some of these schools that have recently gone, quote unquote, gone away from legacy, I mean, if you look at the in that they represent, it's so incredibly small. And that in, even if you took it, it's not like you're wiping all of those away. To Brennan's point, 80% of them were getting in on their own anyway. So if you take like, I don't know, like an Amherst or something that got a lot of credit and a lot of press, what is the in on the number of kids who actually had some kind of a tip or a benefit, like 12? And you multiply that out by another 12 schools, that's what, less than 150 new spots created. I actually think that's going to be somewhat true of the way this whole SCOTUS fallout goes. Race, while considered in a small subset of schools, doesn't mean that all students of certain races were being admitted because that was being considered as one of many factors. In many cases, race was never part of the conversation. That was a great student, great fit, absolutely good to go. They wanted that student anyway, never talked about race, but it came in at points of the conversation. But I don't think that in is so big. I mean, to me, it's like I wish we could fast forward to April when Harvard's admit rate drops to 3.8%, and people won't think that much has changed.
Right. And I mean, you really want to talk about a larger N, then we should start talking about athletics.
Sure.
Right. Where schools like some of those small liberal arts schools are taking a third of their class as recruited athletes. I mean, so, that's the bigger conversation. And just back to the legacy piece for a second. I mean, Rick and I had this conversation, I think this fall or this summer, that I asked, as all these schools go kind of away from legacy, I asked, is Georgia Tech going away from legacy? And he said, we don't need to make an announcement because it's just never been a part of our conversation. And so like when you talk about a trickle or kind of a flood away from legacy admission, some of the kind of proclamations of we no longer do legacy are really just that. They're proclamations. It's a marketing thing, right? Like there's a lot of schools that have just never done it, so they don't need to make a proclamation.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And it's funny on the athletics piece, this is another one we sort of disagree on because I'm like, fine. Look, if that's a way you can meet your enrollment goals, and if this is something that helps you get your brand out there, and if this is something that rallies students to have a better experience, like I'm good with that. But it goes, and Brennan, of course, is a realist in this regard as well. But I do think a lot of people who write about this sometimes, or are pretty vocal on social media in particular, just fail to remember that ultimately these lights are on because dollars pay for them. And, sometimes you've got to get to that, or you always have to get to that through a variety of different strategies. And if athletics at some small liberal arts place in a state that's losing enrollment is a way to do it, and unfortunately that may lead to a slightly less diverse class, well, at least the college is still open.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about athletics because it is, with affirmative action, everything is sort of being looked at in a new way well, it's not just affirmative action. It's the fact that as schools get hard, as a certain subset of schools gets harder to get into. And I really appreciate you guys bringing back the point. This is a very, very small subset. And, and I think, there's a danger in it occupying too much space in the Times and the Post. And, we have to push back against that on podcasts like this as well. You've seen Stanford recently move a number of sports to club. Dartmouth moved a number of sports to club. Do you see that trend continuing? And do you differentiate in your mind, Rick, between a sport that either produces revenue or brings the crowd together, and so there's a sense of esprit de corps, and a sport, I'll say this because I ran track at Michigan State, cross country. You guys are runners. Like, it's great that you do that, but when you're running out in the middle of the woods, are you really elevating the school? Although there might be some wealthy donor who remembers the class of 1965 when they ran, and their big donation to your school depends on you keeping the program. And I think maybe that's part of what you're bringing in when you're saying the lights need to stay on, and you can't ignore factors like that. Just wonder what your thoughts on anything I've shared there about athletics.
I mean, my quick thought is like Dartmouth and Stanford can do pretty much anything they want to do because they have the financial backing and the brand strength to do that. I think what we're talking about is it so if the question is it going to be a trend? again, I don't think we can look at Stanford and Dartmouth and say, because they did this, this will happen. It's kind of funny, actually. I had a conversation with somebody who is pretty well known in the college admission space, more of a journalist background than a practitioner. And when California went test free, he said, well, so goes California, so goes the rest of the country. And I was like, clearly you've never lived in the South. Like, so goes California. The South goes the exact opposite direction. And I do think that we lose sight of that sometimes to say, again, this sort of outpost versus signpost on athletics. But I think, even like take Furman, Greenville, South Carolina, pretty,
Sure.
Strong brand in the region at least, and somewhat nationally as well. And they have disbanded, some sports. So I do think those tough decisions are going to continue to be made. And my thinking on it, yes, is about, as always, like value add. What is the value add? And then what are the dollar and cents? And so to your point, maybe a sport like basketball that brings people together versus a sport like cross country. I'm not sure that's how ADs are thinking. I'm confident alums are going to have a very diverse reaction to that kind of a bifurcation, but I think there's a lot of merit in it. And, at minimum, it is a practical way to approach it.
Friends, this concludes the second part of my interview with Rick Clark and Brennan Barnard. We hope you join us next week for more outstanding conversation about college admissions.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, I really, really enjoyed Lisa's breakdown of Dayton, partly because I've driven around the campus, but I've never actually done tour information sessions. So I learned a lot, and I think you will as well. Listen and enjoy.
Hey, Linda, how's it going?
Hey, Lisa, I'm doing well. How about you? Now that you're back from your big trip to the Midwest.
That's right. I went back to the Midwest, although is Pennsylvania the Midwest? As a former Midwesterner, I would say no. But I went on a trip with a bunch of college counselors, and we started in Pittsburgh and ended up in Cincinnati, and we saw 8 colleges along the way. And I wanted to talk today about one of the schools that I went to see that I think has a lot of really great things about it, but is not as well known as some of the others, and that is the University of Dayton.
Awesome. And Dayton is in the Midwest.
Dayton is definitely in the Midwest. Yeah.
In my geography book, definitely Midwest.
Yeah, absolutely. Dayton is definitely, I think, a solidly Midwestern town. So the University of Dayton is a Catholic university, and it is of the Marianist tradition, which I wasn't super familiar with. I'm more familiar with the Jesuit tradition, but they say they educate for service, justice, and peace, and readily adapt and change with the times. They want to build communities of faith and family and provide a high quality education on a campus that's known for its hospitality and inclusiveness. And I do think that inclusiveness is a central focus at Dayton. The admission rep mentioned that they have a goal of being a completely anti-racist university, and that they're going through and evaluating all of their programs and curriculum and things like that to really kind of make sure that it is anti-racist. And they also took pains to mention that they have a 15% LGBTQ population on campus. So the student body, like 50% of the students are Catholic. And then 50% of the students are not Catholic. So it's kind of 50-50. They have Mass 4 times on Sunday and 1 time during the week where you get to wear your pajamas. And guess which Mass is the most popular? It's pajama Mass. But I mean, there is faith is a central part of campus life, but I didn't find it to be overwhelmingly so. Now, the University of Dayton is 170 years old. And it started when Father Meyer purchased a farm from a guy who wanted to sell his Dayton property and return to Europe. And he gave him a medal of St. Joseph, and he promised him $12,000. So he got the land, and then he started opening the St. Mary's School for Boys. And was the St. Mary's School for a while. It was St. Mary's School, St. Mary's Institute, and St. Mary's College. And then it became the University of Dayton in 1920. And the University of Dayton, kind of describes himself as a national research university that is rooted in the Catholic tradition. So that is where it's at now. Now, Dayton's kind of an interesting place. Linda, did you know that Dayton is the birthplace of aviation?
I did know that, Lisa. And I was going to ask, because Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is right near there.
Right there.
So I was curious if there was, and I know Dayton is really an engineering kind of powerhouse. At least I think it is. You may tell me differently after your visit. If there was any synergy between the university and the Air Force Base.
Absolutely. They do have a lot of military students that come from the Air Force Base that they try to, to integrate into their school, and they're well known for that. And they also have a master's in aerospace engineering that they offer. That seems like a pretty strong program. When we were riding the bus, because we were on the bus, to the University of Dayton, we saw all manner of planes, like giant planes flying over. They were quite impressive, these planes. So, but in addition to having the Wright-Patterson Airport Base, it is also the birthplace of the Wright brothers in their hometown, Orville and Wilbur Wright, who successfully achieved flight in 1903. And the city has about 140,000 citizens right now. And it's kind of politically a purple place. I think the county that Dayton is in has been trending red. I think it used to be more predominantly a Democratic stronghold, but it's been trending red in the last few elections. How is the weather in Dayton? Do you have any thoughts? How is the weather in Dayton?
So my guess is probably a lot like St. Louis. So
yeah.
Always wrong. Hot when it shouldn't be, and cold.
Bad. The weather is always bad.
Yeah, it's like not what it should be.
That's funny. Yeah, the weather's it's like they have 4 seasons. I think they described the winter as being relatively mild. And that it doesn't snow there as much in other parts of Ohio. But they did mention the humid summers. So I'm guessing that's where, it's a partnership with the weather of St. Louis comes into play. The campus is really nice. It's very walkable, I felt like. It seems like it's pretty contained. It's got red brick. Some of the buildings are modern. Some are more, sort of more like, old-time college-y buildings. They have a beautiful chapel that is kind of the center of the main quad that is just gorgeous inside. And they have little food things are everywhere. Like there's a restaurant here. I feel like I did not walk more than 60 seconds without running into yet another food offering from the University of Dayton. And so there's just a lot of different choices. They also recently had redone their rec center. So they're really nice recreational facilities, the workout, the pool, all of that is really great. The school serves 11,000 students. 8,000 of them are undergrad and 3,000 are graduate students. So it seems like, a very pleasant place to spend some time. And when you apply to University of Dayton, you get admitted to a school. So you apply to a specific school and you get admitted. And so one of the schools is the School of Arts and Sciences. Another is the School of Business Administration, the School of Education and Health Sciences, the School of Engineering, and the School of Law, although that is only for graduate degrees, of course. We attended a panel where they had the heads of recruitment from everyone except the law school, all these divisions, and we asked them what their strong programs was. And so in the School of Education and Health Sciences, they have quite a strong education department, a lot of teacher preparation majors, in addition to, your standard early childhood, elementary, secondary. They also have reading specialists, special education specialists. So there's a lot of things that students can add on to their majors. And they really do try to get students licensed in all 50 states. I think Ohio has reciprocity with like 39, but there's always those 11 holdouts, you know. I find that with my psychology license too. You know, somebody's always got to do something a little different. So they will work with you around that. Another really strong program that they have is their nursing program. It is about 25 kids a year that they take in. It is direct admit, and it is the only program at the University of Dayton that is not test optional. So it's interesting because they kind of, if I understand this correctly, the clinical part of their education is kind of outsourced to the community college, which runs a larger registered nurse program. And so the students go and train with those students at the community college for the clinicals and the specific clinical instruction, but everything else they're doing at Dayton. So all their gen eds, and then, you know, any like classroom kind of classes they would take at Dayton. And it's not the kind of thing you can switch in to or transfer into. So someone's like, well, hey, why not just go to the community college for 2 years, right? Get all the things. And yeah, it doesn't work like that. And they only take 20, they'd love to take more nursing students, but they can only take 25 because that's all that the community college will give them.
Is that Sinclair Community
Yes.
College?
Yes, you're
Yeah.
correct.
Just a shout out for the community colleges in the country who are educating a lot of our nurses. So thank you for pointing that out. I love it. You know, I'm a community college fan. Anyway, continue on. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, I mean, I have lots of thoughts, which probably no one wants to listen to on this podcast. And you might not even want to later, but about how we probably need to restructure nursing education, because every school, oh, they have a great nursing program. We accept 17 kids. And yet, you know, we have such a profound need for nurses in our society, and it's only going to get worse, you know, and yet we have it's like always the most selective major at any institution, it seems like. So that just seems like a problem to me.
Which is why so many nurses actually go the community college route, or hospitals have their own colleges of nursing where they go through there, but you're not getting that BSN.
Right. Which is what you need if you want to be in management, or let's say if you want to be a nurse practitioner, you really need that step. So, and I think like nurse practitioners are really needed, you know, it could.
Agreed.
If we don't give people enough opportunities to be them, you know, that's bad, but that's just me. So, another really interesting program or school is their business school. They have a lot of really cool things. One of them is called Flyer Enterprise, because as you might imagine, the Flyer is the University of Dayton's mascot. It's a plane. And so in Flyer Enterprises, it's one of the largest student-run businesses in the nation. So it's an entirely student-run business, and they have 12 divisions. So they have divisions all over campus, and you can go from barista to CEO of one of these divisions before you graduate. And, you know, so they have like advisors in the school, but the students are really making the decision. And I think it's $2.1 million in annual revenue that these businesses are doing. So that seemed really cool to me. Another thing that they have is and other schools have this too. It's sort of like a Shark Tank competition. So they have the Flyer pitch, and you can pitch your idea during the annual competition, and they've launched 70 new ventures through that so far. They also do the thing where they have like a portfolio that they manage, like maybe they get like a little percentage of the endowment or something, and the business students invest that and manage that. And interestingly, they also have a consulting service where they provide complimentary business consulting to nonprofits around the world. And they mentioned microlending in Kenya being one of their projects. So I thought that was kind of cool.
That is cool.
So in business, you can kind of major in the typical majors, but I think you have to go the first year, everyone kind of takes the same courses, and they make you take accounting. And that's how they said they weed out all the people who really don't want to be accountants after they take accounting, which is a lot of them. And then there's all these other great things to do like marketing, you know, or supply chain management or other you know, business avenues that they can go down.
Fun fact, Lisa.
Yes.
It was the accounting class that weeded me out of the business major way back in the day. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, various members of my family have been trying to explain, like, what is it, double entry bookkeeping to me for, I'm going to say, going on 4 decades now. And the blank look of mine never goes away.
I lasted about 2 days in that accounting class. And
I can only imagine that would that would end me, Thank God there was no accounting at the University of Chicago. Thank you. Another great program at school that they have is engineering. And they have, as you mentioned, it's an engineering powerhouse. They have a lot of engineering programs, and they have, several engineering majors like chemical, civil, computer, electrical, and mechanical. The mechanical does a 4+1 with aerospace. And they also have engineering technology majors, which is kind of, I think, if I'm understanding this correctly, and maybe not, but it's more sort of focused less on the theory and more on the practice, and like more on the machines. And like if you're doing computer engineering technology, then you're working on actual computers and servers and things like that, which probably also I would get the same blank space look as accounting, but is highly important. So they offer electrical and computer engineering, industrial engineering, and mechanical engineering technology. Those are all technologies. They have further, they have a lot of bachelor's plus master's programs, and you can often complete your master's degree in a year after you complete your bachelor's degree. And then you get a discounted rate on your tuition once you get your bachelor's degree. So I think it's like 30% off credit hours. So it actually makes it more affordable to get that master's there. And they offer them in all their different subjects. So there's some in biology, chemistry, communication, computer science, public administration, theological studies, accounting. You can get your MPAC. That sounds scary. I don't know what that is. Your MBA, your business analytics, your MBAN, your master's in finance, and then all the engineerings you can get.
So faster and less expensive.
Yeah, faster and less expensive. And I think that, interestingly, they have a renewable and clean energy engineering master's, which seems pretty cool to me. And electro-optics, which, again, I have no idea what that is, but it sounds super important. So that is another real strength, I think, of the schools, that they offer all these accelerated programs.
Friends, this concludes the first part of Lisa and Linda discussing University of Dayton. We hope you'll join us next week for part 2, the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, I'll continue my conversation of MACAC's The State of College Admissions Survey. We'll get more into looking at the data and looking at what does it mean. And then we'll continue with the final part of Chris Chilbert's interview on helping us to understand artificial intelligence, better known as AI. Chris is an expert in the field, has worked with the federal government, has about 30 years experience. And he's also going to share some incredible resources for those of you who really want to dive deeper into this topic. Friends, remember, in this time of decision, it's very important that you remember one thing. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's what you do when you get there, and it's what you do when you get out of there. That is what will determine your career options and your career trajectory. See you Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from and Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.